afternoon, everyone. I hope that you are well. I hope that you are eating or you've just finished eating. I hope that you are well hydrated. Are you having a good day? Are you so glad to see people that you've only seen in Zoom or Teams? Are you so happy to be walking instead of sitting in your chair all day? It's truly a blessing. We have a really special and exciting presentation. I am really excited for this keynote because it is very much the case. I know I've heard from many of you over the last few years that you don't always have a space to be vulnerable, to be tired, to be real about how anxious you might be about the future, to be sad, or just to envision and sort of realize your identity more fully, to celebrate you that maybe others do not celebrate. There is so much to the idea of self-love, and I know over the past several years, as we watched our world being rocked by COVID-19, we started talking about these issues in a way that we had not. And so over these last few years, I had the opportunity to meet people who were deeply entrenched in this care work, in this healing work, in this transformational work. And I want to be honest with you as a leader, it's not necessarily my strength to really put my self-care first. It's something I've really had to struggle with. And I remember meeting CHW and network leaders, and it was very difficult for them to step out of that role of being so hyper-responsible so that they could say, you know what, I just don't know, or I'm just tired today. We want this Unity Conference to be a place for you to literally and figuratively let your hair down. You can take your shoes off if you prefer, if you're just tired of wearing shoes. You know, you don't have to come fancy or any sort of way. And we really mean it when we say that we love you. Even though we don't know everything about you, we can want the best for you, and we can put forward that agape love, which means we really do wish you well. We really do want you to be actualized. So without further ado, we just felt like it would be a wonderful thing if we could invite Dr. Durryle Brooks to be with us during this first day in the afternoon. Durryle, I'm sure you just want to go on with it, but I'll read the bio anyway. Dr. Durryle Brooks is an interdisciplinary researcher and a scholar practitioner from Baltimore, Maryland. He is the founder and CEO of Love and Justice Consulting, LLC, an organization that provides leaders, and all of you are that, with diversity and social justice learning opportunities to increase their capacity to effectively and authentically engage difference through dialogue, critical self-reflective practice, and compassionate communication, something we do not have much of in this world. Durryle holds space for others to do meaningful work that liberates and transforms the personal and collective for our common good. The National Association of CHWs is so honored and thankful to share space and to welcome to the stage Dr. Durryle Brooks.
What's up, everybody? Can y'all hear me? That's what's up. It is so good to be here with you all today. I was telling Denise that while I was sitting here listening to the powerful panel and the stories, I realized that I too am a community health worker. And that for much of my early career in Baltimore City, working street outreach for special populations meant that I was doing the work that folks wouldn't do because of homophobia and transphobia, kept them out of the gay clubs, and required that someone, a group of us, went into those places, making sure that my community had access to comprehensive sexuality education, condoms, and STI panels, and screenings, and healthcare, and so forth. So thank you for allowing me to be here in the community with you all. I have a couple of things I need to pay attention to. One of them is time. I got a clicker. And so, thank you. Thank you for doing what most people refuse to do. And it is an honor to be in community with each and every one of you. And I want to thank Denise for the invitation, the founding board for the vision, and the entire planning committee for inviting me to be here with you all today, as well as each and every single one of you making the choice to be present, to be here, and to be whole. As I reflected on coming here to speak to you today, I thought a lot about my own journey. When did I actually get consumed with giving care? When did I realize that a part of my nature had become such that I would spend most of my time caring for others? And when I got clear about what that was about, if I'm honest, it was during the rise of the crack epidemic in Baltimore City in the early 80s and the 90s, coming up in a time where my family was ravaged by drugs and the war on drugs specifically in Baltimore City, and having to take on adult responsibilities as a 12 and 13-year-old. And so I wondered then, what was the cost of such a burden for a young person like myself, and more specifically, what of it is still inside of me governing my behaviors, even when it is at my own personal expense. So, the question for me becomes, am I aware enough of the stuff that I'm carrying in order to make a difference and to differentiate between sort of what I do out of calling and vocation to give care and what I'm doing out of my own personal need to fulfill something that I wasn't afforded as a child? And getting clear about those distinctions is what my work on love has been about. And so I want to invite us into a couple of things as we sort of move through this space. One of the things, if I had more time, was to offer you this. This is a personal compass that I created in 2014. And if we had time, I would have you in pairs of 2, and to offer you an opportunity to begin to check in with yourself fully and holistically. If I really asked you, how are you feeling physically, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, what would your answer be? How would you begin to give an account for all the good that you're doing in the world? And are you giving an account of the weight and the burden that it also creates on your soul? And so for me, if we had time, we would do this activity, but I invite you to take a moment to check in with yourself, to fully plant yourself where you are, to ask yourself, in this particular moment, what is my body feeling? What does it need? What would it do if I wasn't wearing these too tight pants with this tight belt around my waist? How would it be? As Denise said earlier, would my shoes be off? Would I be comfortable? And I just want you to do a body scan, seriously. Take a deep breath in, and to let it out. To take another deep breath in, and to let it out. And if I'm fully honest and transparent, when I created this in 2014, much of the reason why I did it was because I realized that for many years, the only thing that I had been prioritizing, partly because I was in the academy, was my brain, my intellect. And that it felt like in the educational system and in society at large, I was being reminded every single day that this black queer body does not matter. And so I took an opportunity to figure out, what does it really mean to be whole? And that if you understand nothing else from my session, is that no matter what I talk about in the context of love, that this is the core and foundation of my work. What does it require, and what do I need to pay attention to in order to be whole? And for me, those are at least 4 dimensions of our wholeness that I have to give an account for. So what I want you to do really quickly is the people around you, I want you to have a real quick conversation. I want you to have a conversation about any of these 4 things, or you can have them all. I'll give you about 4 or 5 minutes. What has been your experience having conversations about love as it relates to equity and social justice? How do you define love? What is your personal definition? From your perspective, what is the role of love in ensuring health and well-being of our communities? And more specifically, what practices do you use to ground and resource your mental, physical, emotional, and intellectual well-being? Meet some of the folks at your table and take about 5 minutes to answer any of those questions wherever you have energy. You can begin. You have about 1 more minute. 1 more minute. All right. Now, what I'm going to invite you to do is to literally say thank you to the people that you were literally just talking to and appreciate them for holding a little bit of space for you while we do this work. Thank you. And so, as I do this work and, ask the question, just by the show of hands, how many of the folks answered the question, what practices do you use to ground and resource yourself? Let me just see some hands. Okay, we got some in there. And usually what I notice working with caregivers is that actually that's usually the last question that folks grapple with. That they will give you an analysis of oppression. They can tell you everything that's wrong with the system that they're operating in. But when I ask them about what they're doing to care for themselves, they're often hard-pressed to come up with a solution. And so my invitation to you in this moment, that if you do not have a practice or a set of practices that keep you whole, that will sustain you through the ongoing fight for racial justice and social justice broadly, to please connect with the people at your table around you who did say something and figure out what practices you might need as well. And so, yeah, thank you, yeah. Thank you for that too. I will go a little slower. And so one of the things that I also want to offer is that as I moved through this conversation on love, it became really important for me to do things differently. I talk about myself as a love researcher. So that means that I actually went out and talked with folks, particularly educators, advocates, organizers, social justice change agents. And my dissertation research question was, what is the role of love in social transformation? And inside of that is what you will see in the next 20 minutes or so, which is super abbreviated version, because I usually spend 2 days walking people through this. And also, I talk about myself as a practitioner, because there's something to be said about when we take our thoughts and then when we start putting it to practice, that you start to learn in new and different ways. And so because of this, what I'm going to offer you is some of the reflections from being both. Not only being an academic, but being a practitioner and a social justice agent. So why love? One, love is a core and fundamental aspect of our human existence, and it is necessary for our health and well-being. When people are loved well, they have less stress and anxiety, they have better health outcomes, they better have capacity to engage and hold their own feelings, as well as the needs of others around them. But it's also, more specifically, a major social organizing framework. When we start listening and thinking about the stories and the music that we hear about love and the Disney fairy tales that say that love is something that you fall into and you're not supposed to question it because then it becomes unromantic, all of that stuff has encoded messages around sort of what love is and how it should show up and how it should operate. And so when I talk about a major socializing framework, it impacts how we engage around race, gender, sexuality, class, through the social conditionings that we experience in our families, our childhoods, our educational systems, our broader systems at large, our places of faith and worship. And particularly, that's my brother calling me. I don't know why he's calling me, messing me up. I'll tell him about himself, and he's going to call back. So let me make sure. I thought I silenced this thing. He must have my do not disturb. He's my emergency contact. And specifically, it begins to govern how we engage, connect with ourselves and one another around us. All of that happens through a lens of love. In addition to that, it is not only a major socializing framework, it is a major social organizing phenomenon, specifically when we look at gender relations and labor. Love governs what is acceptable and what is not, particularly around and often in the context of heteronormative relationships. That for most of us who lived outside of the heteronormative paradigm, we got very clear messages from this society, our families maybe, and our broader community, that we are not lovable, and because of that, we don't fit into the norm, and therefore we are disposable. And that was a part of the findings that came out of my work. But basically, when we also begin to look at labor, it starts to break down the same way, that there are specific expectations and norms embedded in these everyday notions of love that govern what is actually work, what's hard work, what's soft work. All of that is coded language to suggest that men are supposed to be doing one thing, providing, breadwinning, and women are supposed to be doing something else, which is laundry, caregiving, taking care of everybody else's needs, not their own. All of that has happened through a heteronormative paradigm. And so when we start looking and engaging and particularly critically analyzing love, the topic of why this matters, because we start to get to interrupt all of those hidden messages that are deeply embedded in our normative understanding of love. But for me, this work is around social justice. And what is important to me is that what I got clear about love is a political project. And it's political because it does a couple of things. Love ascribes and confers value. It designates who matters and who is disposable, and it structures and governs desirability. And it actually begins to establish the conditions of our worthiness. And it begins to determine to what degree someone or something is willing to act on your behalf. So when I talk about love as a political project, it is not just because it is something that we need to just engage as an intellectual activity. It has real life material consequences on people's lived experience. And when we don't love certain kinds of people because they're gay or queer or black or differently abled, we're actually sending very clear messages around who's desirable and who's not, and we begin to make people disposable. And all of that is bound up in the everyday notion of love. And what are some of the impacts of those Disney fairy tales and all these messages we receive around love? It actually begins to produce what I talk about as unique ideological vulnerabilities. One thing I did not tell you before I got started is that I also do work around intimate partner violence prevention. So while my dissertation research was looking at love in the context of social transformation, I get to look at love also from the context of intimate partner violence. And what became clear is that usually in the top 5 reasons why people stay in relationships where there might be abuse is often love as a reason and a rationale. And so if love really is going to do the things that we need it to do, we need to begin to spend time really engaging it. But these unique ideological vulnerabilities, those things are in our minds, our mind map. Ideologies are our mind map and how we begin to make sense of things. It actually starts to produce these consequences around agency. We learn through those narratives that in order to receive love, we begin to either give it, negotiate, or trade it away to be loved. We might find ourselves in a space around our self-worth, which is overvaluing other people's ideas of love over our own, and even at our own expense. And particularly, it might start having impacts on our self-esteem because we will begin to determine the degree of our worthiness and our wholeness by and for and on behalf of other people's expectations. And then lastly, we begin to measure ourselves and how lovable we are by the degree in which it pleases other people. And I believe that becomes really, really dangerous in the context of our social justice work and our work in our care. So what does this mean? Love at the intersection of oppression. So I do anti-racism, diversity, equity, inclusion, whatever language you want to use. I do that work, and I understand and analyze love. And what I got clear about is that one is a gap. There's an absent discourse around what real love and meaningful love looks like. And because the ways in which the systems of oppression tell folks like myself that we don't matter because we are this or we're that, it actually begins to create a love drought. And that in that love drought, it begins to push us into our trauma responses. That when we are not loved well, when we don't have a functional, operational definition of what love is for ourselves, it actually can trigger us and put us in our trauma response mode. And one of the things that I found specifically is that there were at least 3 ways in which that showed up. When we're not loved well, deprivation. That deprivation is one of the outcomes of systemic oppression and the context of love that we do not talk about. And because people are so desperate to be loved, that they actually begin to do anything and anything to get it and to sustain it, even if it is subpar and harmful. It sends people into despair and desperation. And then more specifically, what I talk about is this final state is that when we're not loved well, we actually go into a state of desiccation. That we become so dried out that we don't have the capacity to love. And that only thing that we can do because we are in our traumatized state and survival mode is take, and take. Because I've been so depleted of essential resource, because I have not been loved well, that actually what becomes clear to me is that only thing I can do is try to grab it up. And sometimes I talk about that as folks being energy vampires. All they can do is take. But one of the things that I got clear about when the pandemic hit, and like many of us, I started gardening. And when I started tending to my plants, I learned so much about love, because in that context, it was never any other person's fault if the plants didn't survive. It was my responsibility to figure out how to care for something that did not have words. And more importantly, I learned that desiccation does not mean dead. It just means dried out. And that if there was a moment of hope and aspiration as I thought about this world and things that we face on an ongoing basis, desiccation only meant that in order to revive it, it needed to be submerged in love. It needs to be watered consistently. It needs to be brought back to life. And that takes consistency. That doesn't mean that you got to be the one to do it for that person in your life. Or it might be you. But you need to shower it with love and continued support and nourishment. And so for me, that was really, really important. And so one of the things that I wanted to offer were a few reflections on the work that I did, because what I learned very quickly when I started looking for literature on love, that it was actually very hard to find. That folks only often talked about love in the context of love, romance, that sort of thing, but not in this political sense. Not to suggest that love is a core and central part to social justice, and core and central to our sustainability as movement advocates working for justice. And so what I did was then started trying to find folks who did that. And what I wanted to offer really quickly is that Erich Fromm was an early researcher in the 1900s, and he talked about the commodification of love. That love had become such a commodity like Valentine's Day, all about mass consumerism. And that if love could be bought and sold, that means it could be owned. And anytime that there was ownership in love, that meant that you were a possession, and then possessions don't have feelings and can be treated any kind of way. And so that's one of the gifts that he offered us as a critique around sort of how this country begins to even think about in love. Bell Hooks came through and said, well, actually, not only is it that, but racism and patriarchy specifically and misogyny, we have to give an account for how those things impact love. And that she offers is that love and violence cannot coexist. Love and oppression can't go together. And then she says, we have to have an analysis around gender and particularly sexism and the ways in which men have been socialized to expect from women and to give very little and to even think of them as possessions. And so she offered us that. Dr. King, of course, came in and said, love is love that does justice. And what he offered was that from the civil rights movement, that we actually had to start thinking about love in a much broader and political context, because for Black people, and I think many folks of color, that love had always had a broader understanding, that it wasn't just an individual analysis, it wasn't just about romance, but that love had to be a core and organizing framework to move people through and toward action. And so Dr. King came through with that. James Cone is a Black liberation theologist, and he says that if anything, I don't know which theology y'all been reading, but God has to be on the side of the oppressed. Has to be on the side of the oppressed. And that Paul Tillich says that love, power, and justice had to go together. That if your love didn't have power, it was weak and anemic. And if it was your love had too much power without any sort of care and compassion, all it was violence. And so you needed both of them to go together. And so what I sort of argue is that love, and the particular ways that we think about it today, is not innocent. It actually functions as an ideology to make us believe that love is only reserved for our small individual community and our primary partner. But in reality, for most folks, love had always been about community. It had always been about shifting policies and practices to make organizations support and value Black folks, folks who are differently able, queer folks, et cetera. So that we had to begin to negotiate that, and that when we did not pay attention to the ways in which love in this everyday notion is operated and talked about, we actually just allow it to produce colonization. We allow it to continue to allow and embed white supremacist practices and ideologies into how we think about and to ultimately how we give care. All of that, when we don't challenge this everyday notion of love, allows oppression to exist. So the question then becomes, how and what ways do we begin to check our own self to make sure that the ways in which we're giving love is actually in ways that are liberatory and transformative, and not in ways that require people to become small or to be seen and experienced as unvaluable. And so I wanted to just list a few things specifically about the dangers of not having a critical analysis of love, and particularly around white supremacy. When we don't challenge this notion of love, these Disney fairy tales, it perpetuates white supremacy by allowing and pretending that it's better and more important to choose our head. Oh, thank you. Yes, to choose our head and reason at the expense of our bodies and our emotion. That it requires us to think that our individual lived experience is more important than our community wholeness. It gives us the false assumption that productivity at all costs is all that matters, and that at the end of the day is just capitalism. And that often when we don't check it, it allows for domination and control instead of mutuality and consent. And it allows us to continue to think in ways that produce dehumanization. And to dig into dehumanization a little bit further, that begins to look like self-sacrifice. Folks taking on these ideas of love that require them to sacrifice themselves for their children, for their families, for everybody else except for themselves. That looks like disempowerment, people losing their voice, not having capacity to engage sort of their own needs, wants, desires, and aspirations, but giving it over to someone else. And then ultimately, it has us to distrust and mistrust our own bodies. That when we don't challenge this everyday anemic notion of love, we ultimately show up in a space and unable and incapable of engaging in practices of self-compassion. Because when you begin to analyze oppression, folks think that the primary outcome of oppression is to kill us. I don't think so. I think that is something it will do if necessary, But in reality, what it wants us to do is to feel so disempowered that we lose our voice and that we never ask for what we need in order to be whole. And for me, I think that's why it's become so important for us to engage love. And so in my remaining time, after all that negative Nancy stuff, I thought that it was important to begin to reconceptualize the very idea of love itself. And that if love was going to be the necessary social justice intervention that we needed today, then it was going to have to be measured by what it produces and not by just what is said. And that at the broadest sense, when I begin to reconceptualize love, love is about the mutual co-construction of our personhood. And that through 4 years of therapy and many, many hours of coding the data from my participants, that this definition, this operational definition I want to offer you is a starting place, and it is not something that is required for you to adopt wholesale. But I did want to leave you with that love in this new and reconceptualized way of thinking is about the capacity, will, and courage to nourish and affirm oneself, another, and our community toward unapologetic wholeness and completeness. That if love is going to be radical, it would need to be about those things. It does not benefit you to give your care away such that you can't affirm yourself. Because when you do, you're just playing into systemic oppression. That if the love that you're giving is not sufficiently squared on you while you're doing your individual and your family and your community work, then you're missing a core component of what makes love radical. And that for me, the purpose of a critical theory of love, as I talk about it, a love that really is grounded in social justice, that it would at least have to do these three things. It would have to first help us resist erasure and dehumanization. That if you are in a relationship or a situation on a job that's not allowing you and preparing you with tools to help you resist racism and homophobia and transphobia and ableism, then maybe that's not a loving space for you. But again, that's your choice to make. 2, in order for love to be radical, it would have to help facilitate our own healing. That when we begin to think about the ways in which we're engaged with ourselves and others, love would have to begin to fulfill and to reduce the stress and anxiety. It would be giving us resources to help us move through and move toward greater wholeness and healing. And then ultimately, it'd be all about our voice and giving us resources for us to find it, to discover it, to not silence it anymore because of our traumas and the things we might have experienced, and that they would resource it in ways that not only help my individual self, but also my collective identity as well. And some of the principles that I wanted to offer you are these. So when I was talking to the folks, they were saying, I was asking them about love, and they were like, oh, well, love means so many things. And of that, I said, well, we need to create some principles. And so for me, 1, love has to be first and foremost about self-work in service of self-discovery and affirmation. That means creating and taking up space, developing practices of self-compassion for you first. Love has to be also considered in the context as a sacred covenant. Not in the traditional sort of religious sense of a covenant, but that every life was valuable and mattered. And that for these folks, these educators, activists, organizers, one of the things that they said, and this was, I want unconditional love, love, it's all unconditional. What they said, no, I don't want unconditional love. I need to figure out how to love with boundaries, because when I'm in my family, I need to figure out how to maintain my own agency, my ability to say no when my family or my friends or my networks are putting too much stress on my life. So it wasn't unconditional what they needed. It was actually trying to figure out how to love with boundaries, and that love becomes a measure. The boundary becomes a measure in which someone actually loves you, by when they respected your choice and your space and your opportunity. Again, love had to have an anti-oppressive analysis, that it had to give an account for power. Because when we didn't pay attention to the ways in which power moves through the very concept of love, what we see is often folks in relationships in spaces that are abusive and toxic, and they have no conceptualization on how to get out of it. And then ultimately, love had to be considered an individual as well as a communal regenerative practice. That we had to take time constantly to be in reflection and in ritual practice to honor ourselves and our ancestors and everything that went before us to allow us to be here today. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And when I thought about then sort of if love in the context of social justice work, and we will know it by what fruits it produces, then I also not only wanted to talk about the purpose, but what's the function. And for me, the function is at least fourfold. That in order for love to be radical, it must offer protection. It must offer protection at the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual components of our personhood. It also must provide nourishment to ensure that we feel agency, that we have choice, that our power relies in our choice, that it works and provides nourishment for our self-esteem, and it also helps us to have a critical analysis of where we are as persons and people, and the ways in which we have internalized oppression, so that we can begin to work on it. That love also then would have to talk about safety. It would have to provide safety from erasure and dehumanization, in disempowerment, isolation, and internalized oppression, and that in order for love to be radical, it would also have to provide us with defense. Literal defense against assaults, threats, exploitation, and marginalization. Because without those things, love is anemic, and it will remain a pleasantry, but it would never have any teeth, and it would never move anybody to action. As I begin to wrap up, I need to remind folks that love does not harm. It does not minimize or require you to become small. And more importantly, it does not force you to act in ways that would have you lose yourself. And instead, it should again help us resist erasure and dehumanization. It should actually help us and nourish us and help us grow. And it also should help us heal and to create spaces and practices to help ourselves and other people heal as well. And that because we're out of time, that at the highest level, in order for love to be critical and reimagined in our lives, that we would have to do the work of redefining it in service of social justice and liberation, that it would have to be embodied in our flesh. We'd have to know it there. We'd have to honor our bodies. We'd have to honor our lived experience. It would need to be performed externally to demonstrate to others that it is something that lives outside and it requires action to be observable. That lastly, love had to be measured. And if I had to offer an intervention, is that love needs to be measured not in the academic sense, but in the sense that every single day you get to ask somebody after leaving the conversation that you might have had, did you feel affirmed? Did you feel supported? Do you feel like after this conversation, you feel like you have a little bit more energy to sustain yourself in this fight against erasure and dehumanization and exploitation? And if we can do that, then I believe love will be liberatory, fully transformative, and we would see these changes in policies, practices, and procedures in the society that would honor all of us, no matter who or what we are, and would inspire us to take action, even when we don't understand everything that's going on in someone's life. So thank you so very much. I really appreciate this opportunity and hope. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Do you feel affirmed? Do you feel loved? Have you ever met a love researcher and practitioner? My husband and I were losing our minds over there. We were so excited. I saw so many of you taking photos. Listen, I just want to say thank you on behalf of this whole community.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I so appreciate you for the invitation.
I am so glad I asked you to come. No, sir. We work together. We share an organization together. Listen, I know you all are getting ready to go on to other things, so just a few wrap-ups. One, I want to say, you all know we have a gala this evening. One way that you can help us prepare for the gala is to take your garbage and bring it to a garbage can, okay? So that the crew that comes to help us set up doesn't have to weed through that. Seriously, that's a wonderful way. There are handouts on the table that are for you, right? They're data and information from the National Association. Pick something up, bring it home, or give it to someone else if you see fit. Also, if you are planning to attend the gala, please remember there's a pink band that you were given, and we want to make sure that you have that. Some of you registered, but you don't intend to come to the gala, and that's fine. We have limited capacity. We're going to move some tables out. We're going to put in a dance floor, etc., and you have to be registered to come. So if you know you paid for the gala, but you forgot, you're like, pink band, go down to the registration table, okay? And make sure that you have that. Even if you don't put it on, please make sure that you bring it with you. I also just want to say we are halfway through day one. I can thank Bernadine Mafugo Jerinyama, who's one of our staff members and the lead for the 2023 Unity Conference. Oh, yes. Thank you, dear. Yes. So to keep a space that keeps all of us whole and well, we also have no alcohol at the gala, okay? There is some applause. Yes. For those of us who are living that life, I'm applauding as well. That's for myself. But also, there's no alcohol on the premise, so please don't BYOB. Is that what they say? Yeah, please don't BYOB. I haven't BYOB'd in 28 years, so I can't even really recall what that is. Let's see. The last thing I just want to say is we are grateful for all of the sponsors who have helped us to put this organization, this event together. Some of you have gone in and out of the exhibit hall. If you haven't had a chance to, we'll have some designated time tomorrow for you to go in there. But please go. There are over 60-something, I believe, vendors and poster sessions from community health workers and allies. So please enjoy that. I think those are all of the updates. We want to thank Care Coordination Systems. You'll hear more about them at the gala. They are the conference sponsor, and we're grateful for your presence and your attention. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Be well.